Hey, in this video I will talk to you about the 4 dimensions of learning, and the purpose of talking about the 4 dimensions of learning I've identified is to just demonstrate to you how complex learning is, how complex that process of making meaning is. And I will also introduce very briefly the culture paradigm and show how much that impacts our learners. So when I was thinking about how to begin introducing the whole topic of what is learning, how do we make sense of the world, how do we engage in meaning-making processes, I thought when I start with all these different theories that are out there, that's probably a bit too much and a bit full on, particularly if your subject discipline is not in the educational field. So I thought, okay, maybe the best thing to do in introducing the topic of learning and what is learning, how does it work, is to look at 4 dimensions of learning I have identified. Now, these 4 dimensions I'm talking about are 4 dimensions that emerged for me in my almost 20 years of studying, researching, and engaging with the topic of learning and teaching. And I would say they give you a bit of an overview of the complexity of learning and maybe hopefully make you understand why it is sometimes so difficult for us when we are asked to prove the impact we made on our students. Why that is so difficult. How do we go about measuring these variables? How do we actually figure out how much of what we did had an impact on our students? So let's start. So the 4 dimensions I would like to introduce to you are social, personal, psychological, and biological. To each of these dimensions, there are different concepts, models, theories related. Quite often you will also find an overlap between the different dimensions and very often also between the different theories. So for instance, if you look at social constructivism, which I'm going to introduce later on, that can be looked at from a psychological point of view, from a sociological point of view. So there's always a bit of an overlap. And as I said, colleagues would maybe disagree with my model, or they would maybe change things around. But I thought in the context we are working in at the moment, this is the best possible introduction I could give you. One aspect or maybe dimension I haven't explicitly highlighted in that 4 dimensional model is that of culture. The problem is that culture is almost more like an umbrella. It's the red thread that goes through all the dimensions, and culture will come up in the following presentations again and again. And what I want to give you here is just a very, very brief and rudimentary definition of culture, but that should nevertheless give you a bit of an idea of how significant that is, or that is going to be in the following presentations. So culture is defined by Clifford Geertz, who's a sociologist, as a web of significances, that is norms, values, and beliefs. Later on, it was added that it also includes behavior and cultural practices. So you may or may not have heard of cultural scripts, which are certain behavior patterns that people ought to follow. And that can be particularly challenging if you have international students coming to your university and they don't know the cultural scripts of your institution or of your country. And so their behavior may seem at odds or strange and sometimes even upsetting if they don't follow these cultural scripts, these expectations we have. So I give you a bit of an example that has nothing to do with education, but it's quite a good example for a cultural script. So imagine you're visiting in Glasgow and you want to take a bus. When you are at a bus stop, you have to wave or the bus will just pass you. So the bus will not automatically stop just because someone is at a bus stop. So mind you, my little sister comes to visit and says, oh, I'm off to city center, see you this afternoon. Half an hour she comes back absolutely distraught, telling me that all the buses just passed her, not a single bus stopped. So she had forgotten that she was supposed to wave to make the buses stop. So that is a small example of a cultural script. But this could be, for instance, translated in higher education into something like office hours. Does this mean I can just knock and go in? Does it mean I should send the professor an email before I go to the office hour? Is there a spreadsheet I have to fill in? And these little cultural scripts can even differentiate between different departments in an institution. So talking about this is just a little bit of an awareness of things that might impact your students. But culture is much more than this, and this is why I gave you the UNESCO definition of it as well. So to just give you a very brief overview of that concept. Now, another aspect to really consider is what we call an institutional culture. So the institution we are working in has certain norms and rules. There are certain expectations. You will know which behavior is appropriate, which behavior is not appropriate. You will know what is expected of your students and what your students expect of you. So there are certain rules and certain standards of behavior that everyone in the institution knows, and this has an impact also on the learning. So for instance, maybe a very extreme example of demonstrating that institutional culture would be to say, okay, imagine you are in an institution that has a high focus, or maybe a sole focus, on performance and performativity. In a culture like this, you're probably very likely to find most of your students engage in learning as strategic learners. So strategic learners would be the learners who come to you and say, what do I have to do to get an A+ in my exam? Or what do I have to do to get an A in this assignment? While an institution that has a really strong focus on student-centeredness, on student engagement, might have learners that engage more deeply with the learning, and they might come to you and ask questions more related to, well, what article should I read to help me understand that theory? What should I do to get to grips with this calculation? So these are two extreme examples to demonstrate what an impact institutional culture could have. So it's never that black and white. Another aspect is, while we are talking about institutional culture and behavior patterns, is to think about in culture and out culture. So if you have undertaken your degree in a higher education institution, you have taught in a higher education institution, and you have maybe done your PhD, or maybe even in the same institution, you're pretty much part of that in culture of academia, or if you've been in the same institution all the way through, you're pretty much part of that in culture of that institution. That means you know very well all these norms and values. You know what's expected of you. You know which behavior will be approved of and which behavior will cause conflict. So now enter students in their first year. And maybe to add a little bit to the challenge, make that an international student, or make that a student who is the very first in their family to go to university. Now they come into this big enclosed system and need to try and find a way of negotiating it. So who do I actually ask when I have a question about my grade marks? Do I get to go to the lecture? Do I go to the teaching office? Do I even know that there is a teaching office? Do I know if there is a student learning development service available? All these different things that have to be learned. What is expected from me as a learner? How much of my own work do I have to put in? And how much help can I ask for, or how much help will be available? So all these things the students don't know, when they come to university, further down the line, they will know. And this is also why it's really good to have peer support between students, because older students remember more what their questions were during their first year, because we as academics are sometimes almost a little bit too much in the in culture to see what the problems were when we were students and when we started coming to university. So these are aspects to consider that have all an impact on your students' learning and how your students engage in that learning process. So in these experiences our students have are really, really important in shaping how they engage with learning. What are their previous experiences of learning, for instance? So are they relaxed in a formative learning environment? How well are they in performing in exams? Have they experienced a lot of stress around exams? So do they become very nervous once we are going into the exam period? So have they engaged with the topic before? That also links into interest. So if a student is interested in a topic, they will engage in a more deeper, more meaningful manner in the learning process than if a student is coming into your model or into your program because that's part of their overall degree and they just have to do this to get the overall degree, but they're not really interested in it. So their learning is probably more strategic or more surface learning. So strategic learning, I mentioned earlier, is how to perform in the best way, so what the students have to do to perform best, while surface learners will be the students who do the bare minimum to get through and get a pass in the exams. So personal interests and experiences both can have an impact on the students' engagement in learning. Where it becomes a bit more complicated is when we think about learning as identity negotiation. But effectively, this is what happens. So learning and teaching both can actually be seen as identity negotiations, because that engagement with the environment, when we think about the culture, when we think about the peer networks, think about how new information shapes our brain, shapes how associative networks in our brain are built, or how it changes the story we are telling about ourselves, then engagement in learning changes who we are and how we as learners see the world. And this is where a bit more complex discourse comes into the personal dimension in terms of learning as identity negotiation. So a bit of a cheeky example of how this learning might influence how we see the world or how we think about the world and who we are is this following photo. So I don't know if you've seen in social media, there is a big flat earth movement. So yes, there is indeed something out there, a conspiracy theory that says the earth is not round, the earth is flat, and we are all just taken in by science. It is true, I know. So bear with me. Now, my friends tend to make fun out of that, and someone posted the following photo. If the earth was flat, cats would by now have pushed everything off it. And I think once you've read this and you get this picture in your head, and if you know cats, if you maybe live with cats, you know how they like to push things off tables, sideboards, chairs, basically any surface. Every single time I see one of those flat earth posts popping up on social media, I have that picture in my head of cats pushing things off the globe. So this is not a big example, but it's maybe a little bit of a fun example to show you how it can change how we see the world, because once you have that picture in your head, you cannot really unsee it again. Now we are coming to the maybe a little bit more sciencey bits of learning. So the biological dimension, what I want to highlight here is basically that there are also just literally physical aspects that impact on how we learn. For instance, if you know the concept of synaptic plasticity, is how information is processed in the brain and how flexible the synaptic connections are in the brain and the pathways the information takes. So for instance, when I was teaching students about how to prepare for exams and how to learn and memorize, currently neuro and cognition scientists tell us that repeating information is one aspect that is really important to do while studying for an exam, because that deepens the pathways that the electronic impulses take between the synapses. And if you repeat information, the stronger these neural connections between the synapses are. So then memory, there's a lot of different research around how memory works, how memory functions physically in the body. You have all the concept long-term memory, short-term memory, how that relates to one another. There is research out, for instance, that showcases when students doodle while they are taking notes, they have an improved memory retention. There has been some research out over the last couple of years that says if students are preparing for exams or studying while they are in the outdoors, so particularly when they are in the woods or somewhere where there's lots of greenery, they will have an increased memory retention as well as an increased improved cognitive function. When you think about the IQ is a mixture of biological factors and personal, social factors. There are different theories like the cognitive load theories, how much can our brain actually cope with, how do we process that. So this is the biological dimension that plays a role and interrelates with the other dimensions, with the social, the psychological, and the personal dimension of learning. And I think what makes it so difficult for us to understand how learning works and to find the holy grail of learning, the one thing that rules them all, where we can say this is going to work for everyone, is that complexity of factors in learning, is that interrelation between all these different factors, between how the brain works, how our body functions, and what our interests are, what our values are, what our norms are. And now I'm going to highlight bits for the fourth dimension and then summarize this all for you. Now you may have noticed when I was speaking about the biological dimensions of learning that there is quite some overlap or meandering into psychology. And again, this is just showcasing the complexity of that whole learning process. So what I wanted to introduce to you in the psychological dimensions are a couple of concepts such as motivation, self-efficacy, triadic reciprocal causation, confidence, and again the IQ. When you think about your learners, quite often they are driven by self-efficacy. So this is their knowledge, or not their knowledge, but their perception of how good they are in doing something. So some of your students will grossly overestimate of how good they are, or some of them will underestimate how good they are. And this impacts on how much they engage. So for instance, you might want to pose a challenge to students to engage them to learn. So posing a challenge, something that they really have to engage with, to problem solve, could be considered a cognitive dissonance. And if you create that, cognitive dissonance can be a really good learning incentive. However, that's only for your students with higher self-efficacy and with strong confidence. Students who have low confidence, low self-esteem, and very low self-efficacy might start to disengage and completely withdraw if they have the feeling that this challenge is something they could not solve. Motivation is something that drives our students, and I have mentioned strategic learners and deep learners and surface learners throughout this presentation, and motivation can quite often impact on how our students engage with the learning content. So is a student motivated intrinsically? That means they have an inherent interest in the subject, in the discipline, and that will drive them, that will motivate them much differently than a student who decided to take this degree or to take this course because this would give them a good job once they come out of university. So motivation can have a strong impact on how much they engage and how deeply they engage with the learning. And similar confidence. Sometimes when our students disengage and when they appear even occasionally petulant or sometimes even slightly aggressive, and you wonder what is going on. Having long chats with the students, quite often that is because they are lacking confidence and they are scared and they don't know what to do and they don't know how to ask for help. Or sometimes you have students who entirely withdraw because of a lack of confidence. The triadic reciprocal causation model is something I find really interesting, and I wanted to introduce this to you because it looks into how a person's behavior impacts their environment and also how the environment impacts behavior of a person or can impact a person. So there's a really interesting interrelationship, and the model also looks into self-efficacy and confidence. So it is a really nice model if you are looking for something where you want to maybe explore an issue in your classroom, or you want to figure something out and you don't quite know where to start. That model can give you a really good and actually fairly simple way of thinking about the situation more holistically than just a one dimension of motivation or confidence. Why I introduced self-efficacy, motivation, and confidence to you is because these are fairly easy to measure. So there are brief questionnaires, short questionnaires out you can use if you want to look into the impact one of your interventions or one of your pedagogies has on your students. And a good way of checking that, or one way of checking that I should say, is to look into your students' confidence or their self-efficacy before and after they engage in the learning. That can show you a change in the student. And remember how I was talking about how learning is an identity negotiation, and if you had a positive learning experience, you will have increased motivation, increased confidence, increased self-efficacy. So this is why I wanted to introduce those three, because they can be very simple models you can use to test a pedagogy or to test an intervention. After looking into the 4 different dimensions of learning and introducing to you the impact culture has on the learning process, the next video will look into various learning theories, going from some traditional theories into some more contemporary ones, so you get a bit of an overview there.